Robert sat in the dimly lit living room, his eyes glued to the television screen, though his mind was elsewhere. The hum of the TV barely registered as he turned the glass of whiskey in his hand. He could feel the weight of the silence in the room, the one that had slowly crept in over the last few months. It wasn't the type of silence that brought peace, but one that made you feel the absence of something. Emily was upstairs. She hadn't come down for dinner, something that was becoming all too common. Robert had tried to initiate conversation with her, but she was distant, cold, lost in her own world. He brushed it off at first. She'd been busy with work, stressed with deadlines and meetings. But tonight, it felt different. He could sense the distance between them, palpable and heavy. Their marriage had once been filled with easy laughter, quiet evenings together, and spontaneous plans. They were a team, but recently, Robert found himself questioning if they even knew each other anymore. The spark, the closeness, they were fading, like the last light of day disappearing beyond the horizon. Sighing, he stood up and walked to the kitchen. He opened the fridge, his gaze lingering on the contents, but he wasn't hungry. The uneaten food in front of him felt like a metaphor for their relationship, neglected, left untouched. As he closed the door, his phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, seeing a message from an unknown number. The words were simple, but loaded. "Boss, let's meet tonight." The words hit him like a slap to the face. He had no idea who the number belonged to, but the word boss triggered a wave of anxiety in his chest. He wasn't sure why, but it felt like something was off. He stared at the screen, heart racing. Was Emily meeting someone? Robert dismissed the thought almost immediately. She would never do that. Or would she? No, he thought, shaking his head. I'm just overthinking. It's nothing. But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave him. What was this? Was it just a colleague? Maybe it was a work-related issue. He had to know. He couldn't shake the sense that something was lurking just out of sight, something that would change everything. He glanced up the stairs, listening for any sound coming from upstairs. The house was eerily quiet, just like him, alone in his thoughts. Robert hesitated for a moment, then made a decision. He walked up the stairs and stopped in front of their bedroom door. He didn't want to snoop, but his curiosity was overwhelming. Slowly, he turned the doorknob and pushed the door open just a crack. Emily was sitting on the bed, her back facing him, her phone in her hand. She was texting, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. Robert froze, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, it felt like the entire world was on hold. He wanted to say something, ask her who she was texting, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He closed the door quietly and stepped back. Something was off. Something wasn't right. The rest of the night passed in a haze. Robert couldn't focus on anything. The message lingered in his mind, turning over and over, gnawing at him. What if it was someone else? What if Emily had been hiding something from him all this time? The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He had seen the signs before, the way she pulled away, the long nights working late. She wasn't the woman he had married. But this was different. This felt like a betrayal. Robert went to bed, but sleep eluded him. His mind raced with thoughts of Emily, of the message, of the silent distance between them. How long had this been going on? Was he the fool who had been blind to it all along? He tossed and turned, the image of her texting someone else replaying over and over in his mind. He thought about confronting her, asking her about the message, but something told him he wasn't ready to hear the truth. What if it shattered everything? What if he was already too late? Eventually, he drifted into a restless sleep, but the doubts never left him. They clung to him like a weight around his chest, heavy and suffocating. The storm was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The next morning, Robert found himself staring at Emily as she walked around the kitchen, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. She didn't look at him the way she used to. She didn't smile the same way. It had been happening for a while, he just hadn't wanted to admit it. Now he couldn't deny it anymore. His life, his marriage, everything he thought he knew was unraveling right before his eyes. And yet, he still wanted to believe it wasn't true. but he couldn't shake the feeling that something deep inside had changed. The house felt too quiet. Robert sat in his car, staring at the darkened windows of the cafe. He had never followed Emily before, never even thought to question her loyalty. But tonight was different. His mind was spinning with the message, with the doubt that had been gnawing at him all day. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, answers, confirmation, or just a reason to stop the endless circling thoughts in his head. He watched as the clock ticked past 8:30 p.m. Emily had left the house an hour ago, dressed in one of the outfits he used to love. Tight black jeans and a white blouse that always made her look effortlessly beautiful. But tonight it was like she was wearing a mask, one that Robert couldn't see through. He couldn't understand how things had gotten to this point. The woman he once knew, the woman he had loved so fiercely, was slipping away from him. Through the fogged-up windows of the cafe, Robert could see her. She was sitting at a table near the back, her laughter ringing through the air. But it wasn't the laugh he remembered. It was lighter, almost like she was enjoying something more than a conversation. And then he saw him, James, his best friend, the man he had trusted more than anyone, the man who knew everything about his life, his marriage, his hopes, his dreams. Robert had thought they shared an unbreakable bond. But now, seeing them together like this, the pain in his chest spread like wildfire. The betrayal was unbearable. It wasn't just Emily, it was James too. They both had deceived him. They were close now, laughing in a way that sent a deep pang through his chest. Robert's stomach churned. How long had this been going on? He had never noticed the way they looked at each other, the way their voices had become more intimate. He thought back to all those times James had stayed over at the house, all those dinners and conversations. How could he have been so blind? He wanted to turn away, to leave, to let them have whatever it was they had without confronting them. But the rawness inside him, the anger and the hurt, were too powerful. He needed answers. He had to see for himself, to hear it from her. The doorbell jingled as Emily stood up. Robert's heart skipped. She was walking toward the door. His breath caught in his throat. He stood up and, without thinking, he followed her. They walked down the street toward a dimly lit parking lot where James's car was parked. Robert's mind raced. Was he going to confront them? Was he ready for this? His legs moved on their own. He had no idea what he would say, but his body was pulling him forward. He waited in the shadows, watching as Emily kissed James on the cheek before sliding into his car. Robert's world shifted, tilted sideways. He felt sick, like the ground beneath him wasn't solid anymore. The betrayal was so complete, so personal, that he didn't know how to process it. He stayed hidden, watching them drive away. His hands were clenched into fists. He had no right to follow them, no right to feel this hurt. But all the years of trust, all the moments they had shared, felt like a lie now. He had to confront them. He couldn't go back, couldn't pretend that everything was okay. Robert followed them in his car, heart racing, the distance between him and the couple growing shorter and shorter. The drive felt endless. Every turn they made, every stoplight was another moment of agony. The world was spinning too fast. He had to catch up. When they finally parked outside a small, secluded building on the outskirts of town, Robert parked a few cars behind them. His hands were trembling. He couldn't remember the last time he felt this helpless, this out of control. But as Emily and James stepped out of the car, laughing and talking as if nothing was wrong, it hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a one-time thing. They had been living this life, this secret world, while he had been blind to it. He watched them walk into the building together, the door closing behind them. It was like a door had slammed shut on his entire life. This was it. This was the truth. Robert stayed in the car, staring at the darkened building. He didn't know what he was supposed to feel. Anger, betrayal, shame, all of it. He didn't even know how long he sat there, but eventually he drove home, his mind spinning in 1,000 different directions. As he walked through the door, he felt the weight of the silence again. Emily was upstairs, probably already in bed. She had no idea that he knew. She had no idea that Robert's entire world had shattered just a few hours earlier. But tomorrow, everything would change. The truth was out there now, and there was no going back. Robert stood in the kitchen, the cup of coffee in his hand growing cold. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one sharper and more painful than the last. The reality of what he had learned was still sinking in. Emily and James, his wife, his best friend. The betrayal cut deep, but now there was no turning back. He had to confront her. He had to know the truth, even if it destroyed him. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that only existed in moments of tension. He had heard her moving upstairs, the soft sound of her footsteps echoing through the hallway. He knew she had no idea what was coming. She would never expect him to know. But Robert had seen enough. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He had already seen the truth in his mind, the way she laughed with James, the secret world they had built together. Now he needed to hear it from her. His hand gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, knuckles white. He had to be calm. He had to think before he spoke. He couldn't let his anger control him, not yet. But that was easier said than done. His heart was racing, and his chest felt tight with the weight of what he was about to do. He heard her coming down the stairs, her footsteps soft and measured. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. When she walked into the room, their eyes met. For a brief moment, it felt like the world had stopped. There was a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "Morning," Emily said, her voice soft, almost too calm. Robert didn't return the greeting. He couldn't, not now. "Emily," he said, his voice tight. "We need to talk." The smile faltered on her lips, but she didn't say anything. She just nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her coffee cup on the table. Robert's heart thudded in his chest. This was it. He had to say it, had to hear the words from her mouth, even if it would tear him apart. "I know about you and James," he said, his voice low but steady. For a moment, Emily stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock. It was as if she had been caught in the act of something so devastating that words couldn't escape her. But then she shook her head, her lips trembling. "Robert, don't lie to me," he interrupted, his voice rising. "I saw you both together. I followed you. I saw the way you looked at each other. I saw you kiss him, Emily. You can't deny it anymore." The room seemed to close in on them, the walls pressing in with the weight of the truth. Emily's face turned pale, her eyes darting to the floor as if she couldn't meet his gaze. Robert's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the anger bubbling up inside him. "I never wanted you to find out like this," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say." "Say the truth," Robert shot back, his voice sharp. "Tell me everything. How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me?" Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look at him. Instead, she looked down at the floor, unable to face him. Robert's stomach churned as he saw the way her shoulders trembled, the guilt and shame hanging in the air between them. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Robert. I never meant to hurt you." "Hurt me?" Robert's voice cracked, and he took a step closer, his heart breaking. "How long have you been seeing him, Emily? How long has this been going on?" She wiped her tears away with the back of her hand, her voice barely audible as she spoke. "It started a few months ago. I didn't know how to fix things between us. You were always so busy, and James, he was there. He listened to me. He understood me in a way you didn't." The words hit Robert like a punch to the gut. She had been with James for months, his best friend, the man he trusted more than anyone. He had always thought James was just a friend, a brother, someone who had his back. But now he realized that James had been the one to betray him the most. Emily's voice trembled as she continued. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never meant for it to go this far, but I fell in love with him, Robert. I didn't know how to stop it." Robert's chest tightened, and he staggered back as if he'd been struck. "So you were never going to tell me?" he said, his voice breaking. "You were just going to keep this secret, keep lying to me, to us?" Emily shook her head, her face contorting with guilt. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to lose you, Robert. But I couldn't stop myself. I was so lonely. I felt so alone." "Alone?" Robert's voice grew louder. "You chose him, Emily. You chose to betray me with him. And now I'm supposed to just accept that, just forgive you? She reached out, but Robert pulled away, unable to bear her touch. His heart was shattering and he could barely breathe. The love he had for her was suffocating him, and all he wanted was for it to stop. But he knew it couldn't. The damage was done. I don't know what else to say, Emily whispered, her face crumpling with emotion. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. Robert's gaze hardened. Sorry doesn't fix this. Nothing fixes this. You and James, you're both dead to me now. The finality in his words hit both of them like a wave, and Emily's face crumpled in pain. The tears were flowing freely now, but Robert didn't know if he could still care. The silence that followed was deafening. It was over. The betrayal was complete. Robert couldn't sleep. The bed felt foreign to him now, the sheets cold where Emily's side had once been warm. He lay awake in the darkness, his mind spinning, turning over the events of the past few days. The conversation with Emily still echoed in his head, her tearful apologies, her excuses. But none of it mattered. The trust was shattered, and with it, everything else. He couldn't get the image of James out of his mind, his best friend, the man he had trusted more than anyone. How had he not seen the signs? He had shared so much with James, confided in him, trusted him with his life, and this was how it ended, betrayed by the one man who was supposed to be his brother. The pain was suffocating, but it wasn't just pain. It was anger, a burning, consuming rage that gnawed at him. He had tried to ignore it, tried to bury it beneath the weight of his heartbreak, but it wouldn't stay buried. It kept coming back, stronger every time. Robert sat up in bed, his hands gripping the sides of the mattress, his knuckles white. How could they do this to him? How could Emily, the woman he had loved for years, betray him with the one person he trusted most? He couldn't sit still anymore. He got up and paced the room, his mind racing. He needed answers. This wasn't just about the affair. It was about everything, his life, his choices, his blindness. He had lived in a world where he thought he knew everything, where he thought he had control, but that world had crumbled. And now, all he could feel was rage. The silence of the house was deafening. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft whir of the fan in the corner, felt like intrusions, like reminders of how nothing was right anymore. He needed to confront her again. He needed to make her admit it all, to explain herself, every single moment of this twisted betrayal. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, but when he stepped into the kitchen, he froze. Emily was standing there, her back to him, staring out the window. Her shoulders were hunched, her posture tense, and she looked like she hadn't slept a wink. Robert didn't know what to say at first. The sight of her standing there so broken made his anger flare again. He had been angry before, but now it was a fury he couldn't suppress. "You're still up," he said, his voice colder than he intended. Emily didn't turn around. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her voice shaky. I don't know what to say to you anymore, Robert." Robert stepped closer, his hands clenched at his sides. "Then maybe it's time you said everything," he spat. "How long were you planning to lie to me? How long was I supposed to be a fool while you slept with him?" Emily's shoulders trembled, but she didn't turn to face him. "I never wanted this, Robert," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Hurt me?" Robert snapped, his voice rising. "Do you think that's all this is? Hurt? Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To us?" She finally turned to face him, tears brimming in her eyes. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I don't know how we got here, but I love you. I always have." Robert's laughter was bitter. "Love me? You love me and you've been sleeping with James behind my back." "I'm sorry," Emily said, taking a step toward him. "I was lost. You were distant. I needed someone to listen to me, to make me feel like I mattered. And I know it was wrong. I know I should have talked to you, but I didn't. I didn't know how." Robert shook his head, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on him like 1,000 bricks. "You should have talked to me? You should have told me that you were falling for him while I was out there working, doing everything I could to support us? That's your excuse?" She flinched, her voice trembling. I never wanted it to go this far, Robert. I didn't mean for this to happen." Robert felt the anger rise in him again, this time almost blinding. He took a step forward, his body rigid with tension. "You think saying sorry will fix this? You think I can just forget about everything?" "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "I don't know what I expected. But I never meant to hurt you this way." His vision blurred with rage. He didn't know what hurt more, the fact that she had cheated, or the fact that she didn't seem to fully understand the devastation she had caused. "James was my best friend, Emily," he said through gritted teeth, his voice dangerously low. "I trusted him more than anyone. And now he's nothing but a stranger, a traitor. And you? You chose him. You chose him over me." Tears streamed down Emily's face, but Robert couldn't bring himself to care anymore. He couldn't feel pity for her, not now. "You've destroyed everything," he said, his voice raw with pain. "I gave you my heart, my trust, and you tore it apart. How am I supposed to fix this? How?" There was a long silence between them, heavy with regret and anger. Robert stood, frozen, unable to move, unable to think straight. He felt like he was suffocating, drowning in the weight of the betrayal. "I don't know how to fix it," Emily whispered. "I wish I could turn back time." "But you can't," Robert snapped, his words cold and final. "And neither can I." He turned away from her, his body shaking. He wanted to leave. He needed to leave. The house, their home, had become a prison, a place of lies, betrayal, and heartbreak. It wasn't home anymore. It never would be again. Robert couldn't sleep. It had been 3 days since the confrontation, and the silence in the house was suffocating. Emily stayed upstairs, avoiding him as if he were a stranger. The weight of her betrayal sat heavy on his chest, pressing him down, suffocating him with each breath. The truth of her affair with James was not just painful, it was suffocating. He tried to move past it, tried to pretend like nothing had changed, but everything had. He wasn't the same man anymore. The trust he had given her, the love they had shared, it was all gone. But what hit him hardest wasn't the affair. It was the realization that James, his best friend, had been in on it. James, the man who had been by his side for years, who had shared his deepest secrets, was the one who had betrayed him most profoundly. Robert couldn't shake the thought that this had all been planned. How long had they been lying to him? What else was there? He needed answers. He had to know everything. It wasn't enough to just know about the affair. It wasn't enough to just hear her tearful apologies. He needed to know the whole truth. That's when the idea hit him. He had to go through James's things. It was a violation of trust, yes, but Robert was beyond caring about that. James had already crossed that line. Now it was Robert's turn to take back some control. He picked up his phone and called his old friend's number. The voice on the other end was one he didn't recognize, the voice of an unfamiliar woman, a woman who had been with James, a woman who had shared his life. Robert's stomach churned. It hit him all over again. James had a life he didn't know about, a life he had been keeping from him. The betrayal felt deeper than ever. The woman hesitated when Robert asked about James's apartment. She said James hadn't been around lately, that he had been spending more time out of town. But that didn't sit right. Robert knew James had been hiding something, and the lies were stacking up. James had been living in secret, keeping something from him. There was more to this than Emily's affair. The next morning, Robert drove to the apartment building. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he knew he had to look. He parked a few blocks away and walked to the entrance of the building. The elevator was broken, so he climbed the stairs to the second floor. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached James's apartment door, he hesitated. His heart was pounding in his chest. This wasn't just about confronting Emily anymore. It was about confronting everything. The lies, the betrayal, the secrets. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. It was too quiet. Robert turned the handle and pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, the blinds drawn tightly. The smell of stale air lingered in the room. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The apartment was sparse, almost clinical, nothing like the place James had once described to him. Robert's gaze swept over the room, looking for any sign of life, any trace of his friend, and then he saw it, a small notebook lying on the coffee table. It was one of James's, a gift he had given him years ago. Robert reached for it without thinking, opening it to the first page. It was filled with notes, scribbles, and thoughts. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, each one revealing more than he wanted to know. Some of it was about work, but the further he went, the more personal it became. There were notes about Emily, descriptions of their secret meetings, their conversations, their stolen moments. "I never meant to hurt him." Robert's eyes blurred as he read the words James had written in the margins. It was almost like a confession, one he had never had the courage to voice to him directly. But the worst part was the last line. "I have to make her mine. I have to take her from him. I can't stop now." Robert's heart stopped. This wasn't just an affair. James had been planning this, scheming behind his back. He had been manipulating Emily, making her feel wanted and needed while Robert was busy with his own life. The thought of it, the thought of James not just taking his wife but trying to destroy everything he had built, was too much to bear. He slammed the notebook shut, his breathing shallow. He couldn't believe it. His mind raced, a whirlwind of emotions, but the one thing that stood out the most was betrayal. He felt betrayed by both of them, but it was the betrayal by James that hit hardest. His best friend had turned on him, and for what? For Emily? For control? Robert didn't know. He didn't care. He just knew he couldn't go back to this life. He left the apartment, feeling like the world was crashing down around him. The pain, the confusion, the anger. It was all too much. How could he ever forgive them? When Robert returned home, Emily was sitting on the couch, her face pale and red from crying. She looked up when he entered the room, her eyes filled with fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but Robert stopped her. "I know everything," he said, his voice cold, hard. "I know about the affair. I know about James." The silence between them was unbearable. Emily's face crumpled, but Robert didn't have the strength to comfort her. He was done with the lies, done with the pain. It was over. Robert stood in the living room, his heart racing. The silence between him and Emily felt suffocating, almost unnatural. She sat on the couch, her eyes puffy and red from crying, her hands trembling in her lap. But Robert couldn't feel pity for her. He couldn't bring himself to care anymore. Not after everything. The notebook, the confessions, the secret life James had been leading. It was all too much. He had thought that confronting Emily would bring some closure, but it only opened the floodgates of rage. His best friend, the man who had known him better than anyone. James had been the one to shatter his world, and Emily had allowed it. It was as though they were both working together to destroy everything he had built. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, a fire that was impossible to control. The pain of being betrayed by his wife and his best friend tore at him, each thought sharper than the last. The room seemed to close in on him, the air thick with the weight of betrayal and betrayal alone. Emily spoke first, her voice shaky and barely audible. "Robert, I know I've hurt you. I know I've destroyed everything, but please, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." The words felt hollow, meaningless. Sorry couldn't fix this. Sorry couldn't bring back the trust, the love. Robert clenched his fists, feeling his nails dig into his palms. The urge to scream, to let the fury out, was almost unbearable. "You don't get to apologize to me, Emily," he said, his voice low and deadly. "You don't get to say sorry after everything you've done. You've torn my life apart, and now I have to live with that." Emily's eyes filled with tears again, but Robert couldn't bring himself to care. Her pain felt so small compared to the gaping wound in his chest. "I never meant to hurt you, Robert," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I love you. I do. But James, he made me feel seen, made me feel important when you didn't." The words cut deeper than any knife could. She had admitted it. She had chosen him, chosen James over their life, their marriage, their love. Robert's stomach turned. The betrayal wasn't just about a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a series of choices she had made, choices that had led her straight into James's arms. Robert could feel his body shaking. He needed to get out. He couldn't stand another second in this house, in this nightmare. But then he heard it again. The thought that had been haunting him since he found out. James. The name echoed in his mind, taunting him. James had betrayed him. Not just once, but for months. He had been hiding it. And now it was all coming out. The lies, the manipulation. He wanted to go to James's apartment, confront him, see his face, demand answers. But there was something else. The anger, the rage that was threatening to consume him, told him he didn't need to. He had all the answers now. "Do you think this is over, Emily?" Robert's voice was a low growl filled with venom. "Do you think saying sorry is going to fix this? You and James, you've destroyed everything. You've destroyed me." Her face crumpled and she reached for him, but Robert pulled away sharply. He couldn't touch her anymore. He couldn't feel her hands on his skin, not after everything, not after James. Emily started, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to make this right, but I want to try. I still love you. I'll do anything to fix this." Robert laughed bitterly. "Fix it? How do you fix something that's already broken beyond repair? You've already made your choice." Emily opened her mouth to speak again, but Robert didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to hear her excuses or her pleading. He turned away from her, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel his breath coming in short bursts, the rage building with every passing second. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of this house, this nightmare. He grabbed his coat and stormed out the door, not caring if Emily followed or called out to him. The last thing he wanted was to see her face right now. The last thing he wanted was more of her empty apologies. Outside, the night air was cold, the streets eerily quiet. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty streets as he walked, but he didn't care. He wasn't thinking straight. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, and the only thing he could focus on was the need to get to James. He needed to confront him. He needed to make him pay for what he had done. The car felt like a cage. As he drove toward James's apartment, his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His vision blurred with anger. His thoughts were scattered. But one thing was clear. He couldn't forgive James. He couldn't let him get away with this. The betrayal was too deep, too personal. When he reached the building, he didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He just moved. His fists clenched as he stormed through the door, taking the stairs two at a time. He didn't even know what he was going to say, but it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was making James feel what he had felt. The pain, the betrayal. James's door was open, just slightly ajar. Robert didn't knock. He didn't need to. He shoved the door open, fury burning in his chest. James was sitting on the couch, eyes wide in surprise when he saw Robert standing in the doorway. But there was no apology in his eyes, no remorse, just cold indifference. "What the hell, Robert?" James muttered, standing up. Robert didn't say a word. He lunged forward, his fists connecting with James's face before he could react. The anger, the betrayal, it all exploded in that one punch. James stumbled back, his hands reaching for his face. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he yelled, blood trickling from his nose. But Robert didn't care. He was beyond caring. He raised his fists again, ready to make James feel every ounce of pain he had caused. Robert's mind was spinning. His fists were still clenched from the fight with James, but his body was numb. His heart was still racing, but it was different now. It wasn't just anger, it was something worse, something darker. As he stood over James, watching him struggle to regain his composure, something inside Robert shifted. The rage that had consumed him just moments before began to fade, but the emptiness remained. James was on the floor, wiping the blood from his nose, but there was no apology in his eyes. No guilt. He was still the same, cold, calculating, self-assured. The look he gave Robert was one of contempt, as if Robert was the one who had crossed the line. "You're a fucking psycho, you know that?" James muttered, standing up with difficulty. "You're not even thinking straight." Robert didn't respond. He couldn't. The fight had drained him of all his energy, but the questions in his mind, questions he'd never been able to answer, were now louder than ever. What had James wanted? What had he been trying to take from Robert all this time? "You're just pissed because I beat you to it, huh?" James sneered, brushing the blood off his hands. "I was there for her when you weren't. I gave her the attention you stopped giving her. She needed someone, Robert, someone who actually cared." The words hit Robert like a slap to the face. The truth was harder than the physical blows. James had never cared about him. He had only cared about what he could take. His words echoed in Robert's mind as he stumbled back, away from James. His stomach churned. "Shut up," Robert said through clenched teeth. But the words didn't stop James. He just kept talking, the arrogance oozing from every word. "She never wanted to be with you anymore," James continued, his voice rising in anger. "She wasn't happy with you. You were too busy, too focused on your career, your life. She was just looking for someone who could give her what you couldn't." The words, the accusations, struck deep. Robert had always prided himself on his work ethic, on being the man who took care of everything. But now, the weight of his own choices was crushing him. Was he really the man Emily needed? Had he been so absorbed in his success that he had missed the signs? The signs of a woman slipping away from him, slipping into the arms of his best friend? Robert turned his back on James, walking toward the door. He couldn't stay here. Not in this place. Not with the man who had taken everything from him. James's voice followed him. "You're not the good guy here, Robert. Don't think for a second that you're some fucking victim." Robert slammed the door behind him, but the words still echoed in his mind. Was he really a victim? The car ride back to his house felt like an eternity. He couldn't escape the images in his mind, of Emily and James, of his life unraveling right before his eyes. The world outside seemed distant, unreal. It felt like he was moving through a fog, each passing second heavier than the last. His thoughts raced, but they didn't lead him anywhere. There was no way out of this. He parked his car in the driveway, staring at the front door. Was he even wanted there anymore? The house, once a symbol of safety, of love, had become a prison. He felt like an outsider in his own life. He had fought for this life, for Emily, for everything they had built together, but now it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Inside, the house was silent. Emily was upstairs, he assumed, hiding from him. She hadn't spoken a word to him since the confrontation, and Robert didn't know what to say either. He didn't know if he wanted to hear her explanations, or if he was too far gone to care. His heart was a battlefield. Anger, sadness, betrayal, regret, all tangled together. He walked up the stairs slowly, each step feeling like it took more energy than the last. When he reached the top, he stopped in front of the bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands. She looked small, fragile, almost like a stranger. Robert's heart ached, but the anger was still there, burning in his chest. She looked up at him, eyes swollen from crying. "Robert, please." Her voice broke, but Robert couldn't bring himself to feel sorry for her anymore. "I don't want your apologies," he said, his voice cold, distant. "I don't want your excuses." She stood up, her body trembling. "Then what do you want from me, Robert? Do you want me to just leave? Is that what you want? Do you want to pretend like everything that happened doesn't matter?" Robert took a step forward, his body tense. "I don't know what I want anymore, Emily. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, and I don't know if I even want to try." The words hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Emily's tears fell freely now, her shoulders shaking with the weight of it all. Robert didn't know what he was supposed to feel. He was so tired of the anger, the betrayal, the heartbreak, but he couldn't escape it. It was everywhere. It was inside him. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered, but Robert was too far gone to care anymore. The trust was broken, the damage done, and he couldn't go back. "I'm done," he said quietly. His voice was a whisper of finality. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Emily standing in the darkness, her tears the only thing left in the silence. Robert sat in the cold, sterile cell, the walls closing in on him. The anger that had driven him to this point, the fury that had consumed him for weeks, was finally starting to settle. But in its place, an emptiness lingered, hollow and unforgiving. He had gotten what he wanted, revenge. But now, sitting in the stillness of his own mind, he wondered if it had been worth it. The trial had been swift, the evidence damning. Emily had testified against him, speaking of her own guilt, but also laying the blame squarely on Robert's shoulders. The affair, the violence, everything was laid bare in front of him. Robert had never been one for regrets, but now, for the first time, he questioned his choices. Was this the price of vengeance? His lawyer had pushed for a plea deal. "You'll get less time for manslaughter," he had said, "but you need to show remorse." Remorse? How could he show remorse when he still couldn't make sense of everything that had happened? How could he regret taking control after everything had been stolen from him? The affair, the betrayal, his best friend, his wife, everything he had held dear had been ripped from him. And in the blink of an eye it had all come crashing down. It had felt right at the time, confronting James, hitting him, watching him fall to the floor, his blood staining Robert's hands. But now, as the days dragged on, the rush of violence had faded, leaving only a lingering, bitter taste. The cold reality of prison life was now Robert's new reality. The clinking of metal doors, the echoes of distant voices, the feeling of being watched every second. His cell felt like a suffocating reminder of everything he had lost. Not just his freedom, but his self-respect, his dignity, his life as he knew it. His thoughts drifted back to Emily. She hadn't visited him. He hadn't expected her to, not really. After everything that had happened, he couldn't imagine her walking through those prison doors. Not after how he had turned his back on her, not after how his anger had destroyed their relationship. He had wanted her to suffer, wanted her to feel the same sting of betrayal that he had. But now, the silence between them felt more like a void. The more he thought about her, the more he realized that she had already moved on, leaving him to wallow in his own consequences. And then there was James, the man who had once been his closest friend, the man who had known all his secrets, the man who had shattered his life without hesitation. Robert had always thought he was the strong one, the one who kept everything together. But James had been the one pulling the strings, the one who had manipulated everything behind the scenes. The realization hurt the most. His cell door opened suddenly, and a guard appeared in the doorway looking at him with a disinterested gaze. "You got a visitor," the guard said, his voice flat. Robert blinked, confused. A visitor? It could only be one person. It had to be Emily. His heart raced as he stood up, walking to the door. He felt a tightness in his chest, the anticipation building as the guard led him down the hall to the visitation room. The lights were dim, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant. When Robert entered the room, he saw her sitting there, Emily. Her face was gaunt, her eyes red from crying, her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of everything was too much for her to bear. But she wasn't crying anymore. Her face was neutral, almost empty. Robert couldn't tell if she was here because she had to be or if she wanted to be. She looked up when he sat down across from her. For a moment there was silence. Neither of them spoke. Finally, Emily spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say to you, Robert. I never thought it would end up like this." Robert's throat tightened, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. What was there to say? She had made her choices. He had made his. There was no going back. "I wish I could change it," she continued, her voice faltering. "I wish I could go back to before all of this, before we lost everything." Robert's eyes narrowed. "But we can't, can we? We can't go back." "No," she said quietly, "we can't." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of everything they had lost. Emily's gaze fell to her hands, and Robert couldn't help but think how much she had changed, how much they both had changed. They were no longer the people they used to be. They were ghosts of a life that no longer existed. "You were my world, Robert," Emily whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "I never meant to hurt you, but I did. I know that. I know I destroyed everything." The silence stretched between them, painful and unspoken. This was the price of revenge. This was the cost of everything Robert had done, of the rage that had driven him to hurt the people he loved most. In the end, nothing had been worth it. Nothing could ever undo the damage. Robert didn't know how long they sat there, the minutes stretching into hours. He didn't have the strength to say anything more. Emily had tried to fix it, tried to say the words that would make it all better, but it was too late. When the guard returned to call for the end of the visit, Emily stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving Robert's face. She walked away without looking back. Robert sat there alone in the silence of the room, the weight of consequences pressing down on him. He had wanted revenge, but all he felt now was empty. Empty and alone. What do you think of Robert's actions? Was his revenge justified, or did it go too far? Share your thoughts in the comments below. From 0 to 10, what's your score for this story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And make sure to check out more heart-wrenching tales by clicking here on the end screen.